Welcome to the Euterpean Podcast. This is your host, Zachary Davies. For this episode, I had the honour of welcoming back Professor John Salmon. John was one of my first guests on the podcast, so it's a real pleasure to have him on again. This time, our conversation is all about improvisation. We explore jazz and classical improv, harmony, modes, melody, the differences between composing, improvising, and inventing, and everything in between. This is, of course, a conversation that could last a lifetime. There's so much to talk about. Nevertheless, I feel we covered much ground, and I certainly learned a lot. I would also like to say that this is the first podcast episode I've done that has a video element. To view our conversation, check it out on YouTube. If you would like to support this podcast, perhaps you would consider becoming a patron on Patreon. A link can be found in the description. For more information about this episode or the podcast in general, find me on Instagram or Twitter at zdavismusic. Thank you. Professor John Salmon, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Zach. Very great pleasure to be here with you.
I'm so excited to talk to you today about improvisation. I know we discussed it in our last conversation, but really to explore it further would be so interesting, I'm sure. But perhaps before we do that, it would be an idea just to define our terms, because I know maybe some people have different ideas about what improvisation is. So for you, how do you define improvisation? What is it?
Well, when it comes to improvising music, to improvise in music does not mean to invent a language. It's kind of like speaking. We're speaking now, and we're using a language that exists with grammar, with conventions, tropes, idioms, but we can be spontaneous within our construction usage of that language. And I think it's the same with musicians, that musicians, especially in the Western world, have depended upon harmonic progressions as the basis for improvisation. And even free improvisation, so-called free improvisation, such as Ornette Coleman in the late 1950s, the saxophonist, when he was improvising freely, that is without a particular form or harmonic progression, he would still insert licks that were based on the blues and gospel. So everybody who's improvising is using a language as a springboard.
That's an interesting definition, I suppose, because I'm about to give you a short quote from Stravinsky's Poetics of Music, where he writes that composition is selective improvisation. And that's an interesting idea. In a way, is he defining composition as invention or spontaneous invention? And perhaps what is the difference then between invention and improvisation?
Wow, that's a question that would need another hour or days or months to explore. I think that what Stravinsky may have been implying there is that all composition will have an organic flow to it. It's not mechanically produced. It's not produced devoid of human expression. That all music has to sound as if there's some meaning to it, because otherwise it sounds like just machines. Algorithms, I guess, could compose, but it might be lacking that spontaneity and that human expression quality.
Something about the breath, perhaps. The idea, for some reason, I've just remembered a moment from an interview I heard with Alexander Goh, which I know I'll bring up later on. But he says this is one of the problems with systematically composed music, is that it doesn't have the human breath in a way, in a phrasing in the same quite in the same way. And of course, if you're generating notes, you still have to decide where they go in the register, and there are still compositional decisions to be made.
It's a very tricky question, because let's go to Schoenberg. Just because something is dodecaphonic doesn't mean that there is not an expressive intent behind it. He was very concerned with structure and with order. He made his composition students study the classics. But when Schoenberg writes äußerst kurz, he wants to express something. So there is no such thing as music without expression. And perhaps that's the aspect of spontaneity that makes music something beyond just a series of sounds.
Has improvisation always played a part in your musical life?
Yes. I've been always a jazz pianist and a classical pianist. I can't decide who I am. And I've always played tricks on everybody. I can remember as a 10-year-old once practicing at home, and my grandmother was babysitting me, and she was in the kitchen peeling potatoes, and I decided that I was going to play this piece, but with one hand in one key and one hand in another key. And I remember Mimi coming into where the piano was, and she had the potato in her hand, and she said, "John, are you hitting the right notes? It sounds like you're not hitting the right notes." And I said, "Yes, Mimi, I'm hitting the right notes." I was playing with her. Every single day, I do something naughty at the piano.
Well, that's, again, interesting. You used the word play there. And I think that the word play is something we often forget as musicians, or at least perhaps in my generation of students. It makes me think of Brahms saying, "I'd rather use the word execute for a performance of a piece of music rather than an interpretation." And there's something about the word play that is so creative and free and associated with that.
There's this Latin phrase, if I remember correctly, homo ludens, which means playful man. And we're supposedly identified as Homo sapiens, thinking man. But also, I think cavemen must have also played. Who knows if they came up with a prehistoric way of playing checkers or of word games. I think that's who we are also at essence. We are playing and we're interacting spontaneously with each other.
Right. Yeah, the spontaneity of it, I think, is very important. And I'd like to just go back on something you said about being both a jazz and classical pianist, because somebody I've started to look into a lot more recently is the late Barry Harris. And in several of the videos available online, he overtly says he's not a jazz musician, he's a classical musician. And it's, you sort of think, hang on, what? But this is usually when he's talking about harmony, when he's talking about improvisation, and that really he felt that he was, and the jazz tradition was, an extension of classical music in many ways. So does that also play a part in your being a musician?
Oh, sure. When I think about all the jazz musicians, Keith Jarrett, Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, who had all great backgrounds in classical music. In fact, just last night, I saw the video of Keith Jarrett and Chick Corea playing Mozart's double concerto in E-flat major.
Right.
And then there's Chick Corea playing the Mozart concerto K488, in which he improvises both beforehand, with Bobby McFerrin, and then he has his own cadenza, and then Herbie Hancock playing the Ravel, the second concerto, the second movement of the Ravel G major concerto, in which he improvises with all those 30-second note fiorituras, just magnificent. Duke Ellington started out as a classical pianist. He studied. Dave Brubeck took piano lessons from his mother, much to his mother's occasional frustration, because sometimes he would deviate from the score many times.
Right.
But it could be that Barry Harris was also trying to decategorize his music. Instead of saying it is this type of music, it is, he wanted to say, no, I'm a musician, pure and simple. Maybe that was one of his intents.
Yeah, sort of reminds me of Duke Ellington saying there are only two kinds of music. There's good and there's bad, or, you know, if it don't swing, it don't mean a thing, right? So
yeah,
it seems to be in several places in the history of jazz. And I suppose this is where jazz education comes under fire, perhaps. And I've got a couple of questions actually about Barry Harris's thoughts, because they're in many ways quite controversial and interesting, but therefore also important. And he was quite critical of several aspects of the system of jazz education or jazz theory that often came about, and usually commenting on the topic of modes. Personally, modes in jazz have always been a little confusing, not so much in modal jazz so much, but actually when people just say, oh, I'm going to use a Lydian scale here or a Dorian scale here, I'd always think, but why and when? How do you make those decisions? It was only when Barry mentioned that a D minor 7 chord in C major was different to one in B flat, because they use different scales. One uses an E flat, and one doesn't. One's at Dorian, one's Aeolian, and that just a light bulb came on in my mind. And yet his explanation of modal scales, although he would never label them as that, is rarely discussed. So I guess I have two questions here. First is, do you agree with Barry about the utility of modes and their nomenclature, or the controversy around that? And secondly, which I suppose depends on your first answer, how best can musicians learn to improvise using modes?
Yes, those are also big questions. You know that when jazz theory first emerged in the late 50s and early 1960s, one of the tenets was the relationship between scales and chords. Trying to teach someone how to improvise, you have to know that a certain chord or a certain progression will imply a certain scale. And of course, that's fundamental. And perhaps it's been systematized a little too much by jazz theory. They're always thinking, oh, I get to this chord, therefore I have to play this scale. If I play a diminished sevenths chord, I have to play this octatonic. If I play this G7 flat 13 sharp 9 flat 9, I have to play an altered scale or Lydian dominant. And of course that could be useful, but I understand that some of these greats in jazz felt a little bit like it was trying to codify their art. It's ironic that Bud Powell had never studied modal jazz, and he was one of the greats. And sometimes he goes outside of what jazz theory would teach. When Bud Powell plays Night in Tunisia, this chord, an E flat 13 sharp 11, E flat 13 9 sharp 11. That implies for jazz theory what's called the Lydian dominant. But there's a chorus that Bud Powell plays this lick. This. Those two notes don't belong to the Lydian dominant. Miles Davis, when he's playing So What, which is supposedly based on the Dorian mode, and he does use a lot of Dorian, but he also adds sometimes sharp 7 and sometimes a flat 5. So, Zach, I'm going off into a rant. You can very easily say, please stop, my brain is full.
No. It's wonderful. And I'm so fascinated by all of those examples, because it makes you wonder then, of course, we try to systematize or codify or in an attempt to understand what's going on. And yet the contemporary music never seems to completely agree with the perhaps rather conservative ideals of what the textbooks set out, right?
Yeah, it's true that theory always comes after practice. The first description of sonata form, if I recall correctly, didn't appear until the 1815, 1820. And by then, Mozart and Beethoven had already composed a lot of sonatas. Everybody knew what it was, but an attempt to explain it or codify it had never really happened. Theory always happens after the practice, and of course, I'm a great believer in theory. I love jazz theory books. When I read Mark Levine's book on jazz theory, which is also based on this chord scale relationship, that certain chords imply certain scales, I found it very interesting. So I don't think it's useless, but it's not everything.
Right. And so, aside from the books, and there are many of them, I've read passages from Mark Levine's jazz theory book. How would you recommend people go about, or musicians go about, learning, maybe not jazz theory, but how to improvise in the style of people who deviate from these theoretical boundaries?
Well, of course, the easy, obvious answer is you have to walk in the footsteps of the greats. I have to be able to play. I could play. Which is that's Dave Brubeck's improvisation on his Bossa Nova USA. And everybody who's played anything from the bebop era knows that's a Charlie Parker lick. Everybody knows the standard licks, and that's a way. I remember once as a high school student, I hung out in the halls of North Texas in Denton, which was a big jazz school. And I remember hearing saxophonists playing these licks in every key. And then they would play another lick in every key. And that was the way jazz was taught. You learn licks in every key. And of course, that has to happen. You have to have a bag of tricks, if you will, or idioms. You can't just improvise without idioms. When John Coltrane played Giant Steps, he uses sometimes the same lick in different choruses. So it's obvious that he had also a reservoir of tricks he could use. Well, not tricks, but tropes, idioms, conventions.
Like a toolbox, perhaps.
Yes, a toolbox.
Yeah.
That all improvisers have to have the toolbox.
I suppose so. That brings me on to a final question I have to do with Barry Harris, and it's related, but it's about playing classical music. And again, you can find him saying in several places that for him, the main reason to learn classical music was exactly that. It was to tread in the footsteps of the composers and to learn how they made decisions. Do you feel that's the only thing or we can get from playing classical music, or do you feel that there are, or do you feel we sometimes neglect that as classical musicians?
Well, I don't play classical music as an exercise in pedagogy. I mean, for me, it's the mystery of the music. It speaks to me. I mean, I learn from it, but I play it because it speaks to me in a very powerful way. It's not that we study classical music just because it's going to help our jazz skills. But it's true that if you know classical progressions, that those are the first chords of the Goldberg variations. Guess what? That chord progression starts in G major and then has a 2-5-1 to D major. So if I were doing jazz, that's the first 4 bars of the Goldberg variations. So jazz harmonies did not emerge ex nihilo from nothing. They are built on decades, centuries of tradition. So in that sense, Barry Harris is correct that it's just one big tradition. If you learn all the chord progressions in classical, so-called classical music, that's a big tool for jazz. When Herbie Hancock is improvising in the second movement of the Ravel G major concerto, it's amazing how Ravel's harmonic progressions mirror Herbie Hancock's harmonic progressions. It's like they're same brothers from another mother, you know.
Right. Yes.
Have the same. They belong to the same aesthetic world.
Well, yes, and not just in a linear way. I think that also I know, for instance, having read Miles Davis's autobiography, that he was very influenced by the Ravel Concerto for the Left Hand and Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto Number 4, and lots of other classical music. And he had his problems, his issues with classical music, but he certainly loved many elements of it and implemented it into his music. So yes, I suppose it depends what your intent is on learning, but I think that understanding harmony and composition from playing classical music is really not one of the main intentions of a lot of students. And I class myself in that group. And since I heard Barry Harris say that, I've been thinking a lot more harmonically, a lot more structurally, to really understand what was going on in their minds, and it's very revealing in that way.
Indeed.
So, I've got another question now, and it's back about that interview on the Samuel Andreev podcast with Alexander Gurr, and he mentions, and I'm paraphrasing, that in order to develop as a composer, you must be able to improvise. In other words, but for him, that also meant extrapolating from one musical idea, several musical ideas. And so I guess my question is, as an expert improviser, what would you recommend that musicians do to introduce improvisation into their lives, especially if they're not accustomed to it? We've discussed treading in the footsteps of the masters. I imagine listening is an important element to that as well.
Yes. Here at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, I have a course called Keyboard Harmony, which is a required course for all of our piano performance majors. And the first semester is an introduction to mainly diatonic harmonies, mainly SAT-B, 4 voices, 3 voices in the right hand, that are based on the progressions that are central to the Western canon. So they have to do in every key without the score in front of them. And then I also asked them to come up with some stylistic, textural, rhythmic variant, even something simple like arpeggiation, or can you do it in the style of a brass quintet that is bringing the king into our presence. That was a cadence. They learned this progression and how to do it with passing tones. And of course, a few secondary dominants. Because in improvisation, you have to be able to master harmony. Oh, here's something kind of interesting. In the improvisation treatises of the 18th century, most of them were harmony treatises, how to do these exercises. And even Czerny's treatise on improvisation, which he wrote around 1829, is a series of chord progressions, and he asks that you have to do them all in every key. So everybody has to be able to do and then if I know these progressions, I improvise with them. Every single day, I improvise at the piano. And I always take a progression. Sometimes I'll come up with some chords that are not functional and put them together anyway. Like, I don't know, like, oh, that's not functional, but I'm going to use it anyway. How about, that's a minor 9 chord. I'm just using it in different combinations. For me, improvisation is joined at the hip to being able to come up with harmonies. And
Right.
I bet that even people who play single line instruments, saxophonists, I think they have to be also thinking harmonically, not just melodic transposition.
Sure. I think, yes. Okay. So there's harmony and, well, transcription, as we've talked about before. The idea of melodic improvisation, which is of course linked to harmony, because we've talked about this before. The melody and a note will imply harmony. It will imply a chord. Even if you go somewhere else, it still has a certain tension with harmony. So this is, and I suppose this is linking to my question about modes earlier, but when, say, improvising a solo, say you're improvising, you've played the head of something, a tune, and then I suppose you're completely free within the confines of the harmony of the tune. Say Georgia on My Mind, that tune, you play the head and then you do a solo. Some people, I'm just thinking of maybe Chet Baker, for instance, his form of improvisation often was like a counter melody to the main melody, and they would often be very harmonically compatible, but they would also be very complementary together. But I suppose you could also play around with a lot of ornamentation and figurations. this is such an enormous world that I'm just not sure how I would define the parameters that I would use to improvise in a solo in a tune like that. Do you have any any advice to musicians in that, on that topic?
Well, I think the harmonic scheme has to be there. I mean, for unless it's free jazz, which is, where there's may not be a prescribed harmonic scheme, but even in free jazz, as I mentioned earlier, the tradition is to use some licks that you've used before, even if there's no prescribed harmonic scheme. But I would say that jazz without a harmonic scheme is kind of a non-existent, because if I'm playing that was All the Things You Are. So my left hand is basically giving me the context within which my right hand improvises. That's the way when I first play a solo, my left hand is giving me the harmonic scheme, and that left hand, that context, provides the environment within which the right hand, my melody, will improvise. Now, of course, sometimes you can have the left hand improvising the melody too, but this is just the way my brain works. The first thing I do is this. So if I were playing, that's Satin Doll. So I'm thinking 2 5 2 5 2 5 2 5 2 5 2 5 1. 2 5 in different keys. In jazz theory, 2 5 is a big concept. A 2 chord and then a 5. A super in classical be supertonic dominant.
Right.
And Satin Doll is supertonic in C major. Supertonic dominant C major, and then supertonic dominant in D major, and then G major in G flat major, and then we finally get a 1, a tonic at the end. So Zach, I forget what the question was.
Well, it was just about advice to musicians when improvising melodies over those harmonies. And I noticed there that when you're going from the 2 5 2 5 or just around the circle of fifths, you're often using melodic sequences that sort of would rise or fall. That's
It's hard not to think in terms of melodic sequences. The original tune is a melodic sequence. And then so it's very easy to think of this. Sequences are all over jazz. No matter the progression, here's that Bossa Nova USA of Dave Brubeck. That's the chord pattern. So if I go, I did the same lick in a different key. I would say that sequences is a very natural way. If you have the same progression, it's easy to put the same melodic figure over that progression.
Right. I see. And perhaps we could just explore a bit of your playing and improvising in classical music, because I know that that's something you also do. And indeed, I watched your lecture on YouTube, called Improvising in Beethoven, and you improvise in several Beethoven sonatas, from improvising ornaments and lead-ins, but also to fully improvised passages, such as the development section in the Waldstein Sonata. So are you going through the same musical processes there? And what limitations do you adopt in that case? Because I imagine there'll also be lots of stylistic restraints that you put on yourself, because you wouldn't be able to just start playing a blues scale or a major Lydian in the
Well,
Waldstein.
it is true. If I'm playing Beethoven, I have his language. You know, if I'm speaking to you in German, and I have this conversation in German, I'm going to keep talking to you in German. The things that I did in that lecture, Improvising in Beethoven, were the kinds of things that Beethoven himself might have done. They were definitely in his harmonic, using his harmonic and compositional language. And the most radical idea is perhaps just improvising it all in Beethoven, because, you know, Czerny, who got his hand slapped, Czerny is central to this discussion. Czerny got his hand slapped by Beethoven in 1816. It seems that Czerny was playing, Carl Czerny, the student of Beethoven, was playing Beethoven's piano woodwind quintet, and he dared to add some notes or to make some kind of alteration. And the next day, Beethoven sent him a letter saying, you'll forgive a composer who would prefer to hear his works performed as written. Well, that became Czerny's mantra for the rest of his life. And it's so ironic because he had already written a treatise on improvising, in which he talks about the sorts of places that Beethoven improvised and where you be expected to improvise in recitative, at a cadential 6/4, at a diminished seventh chord. And yet Czerny himself was forever smitten by that one slap on the hand. And for some reason, that contributed to the perception that you cannot alter anything in Beethoven's scores. So what I did in that lecture will seem heretical and downright disrespectful to some piano teachers. That's another topic. We're not going to talk about literalism. I love Sviatoslav Richter. Okay, don't get me wrong. Love Sviatoslav Richter. But this idea that you can never add, subtract, do anything different from what's in the score is preposterous to me. I'll never forget hearing Richter play the Schubert F minor sonata once in Freiburg. And none of us piano students knew that work at that point. The first movement is unfinished. And when Richter got to the point at the end of the retransition, right before the recapitulation, he simply lifted his hands off the keyboard. And we were in the audience shocked. We said, has Richter had a memory lapse? But of course, it was his way of saying, no, I'm not going to play anything that the composer didn't write. And vice versa, I will always do what's in the score. If there was a repetition sign, do it. Not to do it meant that you were a member of the Philistines, to invoke a Schumannesque term.
Right. And I imagine then when you improvise, you also draw upon the treaties that you mentioned and sources like that, historical sources.
Ironically, Czerny himself, when he's describing one of the ways that Beethoven himself improvised, he talks about coming up with new themes in the development section of a sonata form. And that's what I did, if I recall, in the Waldstein. I used a theme, this theme, which, if I recall, Beethoven did not use that theme in the development section. But I took that very theme and I converted it to the key of F minor. It's an E major. I think I did something like. something like that. And that's, according to Czerny, exactly what Beethoven used to do. Take themes that he had come up with in the exposition, and he developed them spontaneously.
Right. Yeah. And it also sheds light on an awful lot of other composers, even Chopin, formidable improviser, wouldn't play the same piece twice in the same way. And yet we do have this kind of strange attitude towards the score, which sort of brings us back to one of the first questions about composition being selective improvisation. It just so happened that day that the composer made the decision to go in this direction rather than that direction, when they may have listened to something that the next day and been influenced by it and decided to go somewhere else with it. So it's a strange, almost reification of the work, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that is a reflection of the Werktreuer ideology, which emerged in the 19th century, and especially in Germany. And I read all kinds of texts related to that. One of the articles that I found fascinating was by a musicologist named Joshua Navon. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly. It was written in the Journal of Musicology last year, I think. And he's discussing how the Leipzig Conservatory, founded in 1843 by Mendelssohn as the director, contributed to this ideology of doing only what's in the score. And one of the things that Mendelssohn instituted was you could have piano performance majors and composition majors, but you couldn't do both. Unlike in Italy, where everybody was improvising and doing music theory, and we're practicing technique and all at the same time. Partimenti. Do you know the word partimenti, which is a harmony exercise? And in Italy, they had to do it on the piano at the spot. They had to demonstrate they could do this skill. In Germany, however, it became a rote paper exercise where you write it, you don't play it. So that also contributed to the idea that you have a performer and you have a composer, and you can't mix the two.
I think that's this is also drawing upon how we can, how I and other musicians can learn about improvisation, because as you said there, they were playing the chord progressions. They weren't just analyzing them and looking at the score, and they may have done some of that, of course, but it's a very tangible relationship with chords and harmonies, and perhaps that is what is required when improvising, because if it has to become second nature, it has to be embodied, very literally embodied, right?
That's true. It's not just something that you find on the paper, as theory became simply rote exercises done on paper, at least in Germany. But my keyboard harmony class, they have to demonstrate that they can play the progression, and then they can do something with the progression. Like I had one of my students a couple of days ago, a graduate student who's taking this as an independent study, and I had her do the basic cadence in G minor. And then I said, I want you to take those chords and roll them in the left hand. And I want you to come up with some fioritura melodic in the right hand. Which is, of course, the way keyboardists would improvise, whether it was preludieren, to preludize, or to come up with a fantasy. You had, first of all, a chord progression. Bach had that, and that progression became the basis for the composition.
It does make me wonder, therefore, have you ever experimented with improvising not just thematically as you did in the Beethoven. Of course, that involved harmony and melody, and it's not just one unit. And I'm not trying to put it in a box, but say something like the Goldberg variations, where you have I think it's 32 bars of harmonic structure, and then a load of variations. Would it be an experiment to play the aria and then to improvise your own variation, or even perhaps to take it into the world of jazz, as many of those 251s are in there?
Yeah. I've never done it with the Goldberg variations, but you know who has? Dan Tepfer. He plays the Goldberg variations and he adds his own improvised, sometimes jazzy, sometimes not really jazzy. And they're all based on the same chord progression. I've not done it with the Goldberg. Oh, but here's something I did do one time with my jazz trio. We took the E minor prelude of Chopin, etc. And then I played it as written, and then I got to the end, and then I modulated to D minor and went to 5/4. And then I played How Insensitive, Antonio Carlos Jobim's Bossa Nova, but I put it in 5/4 in the style, in D minor, but in the style of Chopin's E minor prelude. Because this chord progression with the descending chromatic, I think Jobim must have also been a student of Chopin. All the great composers, whether they're jazz composers, John Williams, film composers, they all knew those progressions. Oh, even Dave Brubeck. When, you know this piece by Brubeck called Dziękuję?
Sure.
And he wrote that in Poland one time on a tour in 1958. And it was an expression of gratitude for the people in Poland who had treated them so nicely. And he didn't realize, I don't think, that he'd taken that theme from the beginning of a mazurka by Chopin in B flat minor, which starts out almost exactly the same way. I won't try to find it now. I don't remember exactly which one it was, but that theme, I'm sure he heard his mother play. His mother was a piano teacher. So that seeped into his brain. So I haven't done the Goldberg yet, but I'm sort of intimidated by watching Dan Tepfer. But I should be able to. So that was the chord progression of the first 4 bars of the Goldberg. So maybe I should do that.
Yeah, well, that sounded beautiful. And along those lines, have you got any improvisation projects, piano projects that you're working on in the near future?
Oh yes, that's a very good question. I know this doctor in Jaén, Spain, who she's also very involved with the music community, and she asked me. She and a number of her artist friends are putting together a project to support breast cancer patients, and she asked me if I could do an improvisation that would somehow be related to that. So in 2 weeks, I'm going to make an improvisation called Esperanza, Hope. And I will somehow make a 3 to 4 or 5 minute improvisation based on the idea of hope, perhaps starting out a little bit with pain and suffering, but then gradually morphing into a vision of hope. So I had not thought about that until we just settled on that just 2 days ago. But I'll have to do this on February 13th, and that's a lot of pressure to say, okay, I'm going to improvise something that's going to be an inspiration to breast cancer patients.
Will it be available to listen to online or?
Yes, what they're going to do, we just worked out the details, is they're going to have a book, I think a digital book with poems, paintings, and what they'll have is a QR code that you can scan, and it will take you to the video of me doing the performance. She'd asked if I could write a piece and have it ready by February 20th, and I said, I don't think that's going to be possible. That takes too much time. But improvisation, yes, I could do.
Okay. Well, that sounds like a great place to end, and I'd like to thank you so much, because that was a wonderful conversation, and I've got a lot to study now. I feel like I need to practice some chord changes.
Yeah. Well, Zach, if you or any of your listeners have any questions or comments, come visit me. I'm very easily found on the internet, johnsalmon.com, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation. And thank you so much for doing this valuable contribution to a topic that's under discussed, at least in the classical world.
Not at all. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Zach.